Welcome everyone into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is June 5th, a Wednesday around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the House settlement and how some of that money might be split. There are some couple ideas that have been thrown out there over the last week and a half that I want to get into a little bit and how Title IX might be just a little bit overlooked in this conversation. Then we'll get into a little bit of talk around Kadyn Proctor. It sounds like he fully regrets the decisions that he made with transferring to Iowa and then finding his way right back to Alabama. It sounds like he should have just stayed at Alabama, and he fully realizes that as well. So I want to get into that and why it's a really good thing for what the future of the portal holds for us. Then I want to get into playoff Cinderellas here for a minute. I think a lot of people are looking forward to seeing a group of 5 team make a deep run in the 12-team playoff. I'd be a little bit surprised if those were the Cinderellas that we ended up seeing. So I want to break down who I think the Cinderellas actually will be. Then we have an all-transfer team on the defensive side of the ball. We did the offense yesterday, so figured we'll follow up with the defense today before we finish it out with a Spotlight Wednesday. And we're going to talk about one of the most overlooked teams in the entire country, in my opinion, Oklahoma State. They're one of the teams that returns just so much ability and so much veteran leadership that they're going to be really hard to beat. I'll put it that way. But before we jump in here, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for both of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's start talking about this house settlement money, because that's the next big hurdle, right? We got over the big hurdle of just getting all of these court cases out in the open and dealing with them and getting them in the rearview mirror. Now, there's going to be more ahead, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but we now have at least what the number is for revenue sharing, which is $22 million per year. That is the top amount that you can do. Now, smaller schools obviously will likely do something under that because they can't much afford the $22 million. But there are different ways that people are thinking about possibly implementing that. And it's a very, very interesting conversation that a lot of people don't really know the rules to. And we'll get to that throughout this segment. But one of the big time questions is, where does this money go, and does it really hurt the non-revenue sports, the women's sports, some of the sports that maybe weren't talked about quite as much as they probably should have in these discussions? So the Baylor president, Linda Livingstone, had a very, very interesting comment where she said she was very optimistic that they didn't have to cut any sports, that they could absolutely make this work and not be, in a scenario where 5-10 years down the road, they start cutting off those Olympic sports where you would love for that not to happen, obviously. So that's obviously something that's great to hear from someone that is going to be in on these conversations. She seems very, very intent on making that work, and frankly, I think she's right. There is a path forward for all of this to work out, especially if you're going to keep collectives in on the party. You got to be able to split this thing evenly. And I fully understand that, you're going to want to push a lot of money in the direction of football and men's basketball and baseball and the revenue-making sports. There's no two ways about that. But with NIL, with some of the other revenue streams that these players have access to, we all know that the football players, the basketball players, the baseball players have more access to those than pretty much anyone else on campus, because they are the revenue sharing sports, because they are the ones that have a little bit more, juice around them, around those campuses. So those guys are going to benefit. There's no two ways about that. They're always going to get their NIL money. They're always going to have that ability to get that NIL money. The thing is, that doesn't necessarily apply to the swimmings of the world or softball or a million other sports. I'm blanking on smaller sports right now, but just in general, there's a way college athletics can move forward where this actually works, and it actually works better than what we had before, because I do think that with this $22 million, depending on, what that number looks like across the country, you can give a huge lump sum to some sports that have not had it in any way in the past. And I think even if you split this thing down the middle, where $11 million goes to women's sports, $11 million goes to men's sports, you still have the ability to compensate the men's sports in NIL and scholarships and different things that kind of bridge that gap to keep you at a competitive advantage without maybe getting you into a little bit of trouble down the road, which is kind of the biggest question here, and something that I think a lot of people have been watching very, very closely is the impact this will have on Title IX, because a lot of people are very confused. A lot of people don't really know what the rules are in terms of how this money can be allocated. And one of the things that I've seen, I believe Yahoo Sports was the one that reported this, and SEC presidents are not going to shy away from trying to get around Title IX in this kind of lawsuit. I mean, when you look at what the payments are going to do over the next 10 years, 90% of those are going to Power 5 schools. 90% of those in particular are going to college football and men's basketball players from the past. And that opens a little bit of a door, and the SEC is trying to run straight through it because they are trying to allocate 80% to football, 10% to other men's sports, and then 10% left for women's sports. So they're essentially saying, if this money, the payout money that we are giving up is going to these players anyway, why can't, on the back end, we give it to these players? So it's a very, very fascinating argument, and one that might be able to hold up. I don't really know how people are viewing this in these conversations. I don't really know how this is going to move forward, but I will say it is one of the big questions, and it is one of those things where you love to see all the conferences kind of on the same page going forward, because you don't want a scenario where, say, SEC has this rule where it's 80% going towards football, and the Georgia, Bama, Texas, all of those teams have the ability to just blow everyone else out of the water. And then you look over and you're at Ohio State, or even if you're at Kansas State or Utah in the Big 12, you want to compete with those guys. You want to be in those conversations, and you might just have to follow suit to do that. Now, the issue with that is not everyone has the ability to bridge that gap on the other side. As we just talked about, bridging the gap where if you were to split it 50-50 down the middle, you could get collectives and NIL and all of that different stuff involved for the men's sports really aggressively and bridge that gap. You can do the same thing on the women's side, where maybe you do give 80 or 90% of this money to men's sports, but give women's sports more scholarships, give women's sports a little bit more of NIL abilities and opportunities. But that does beg the question of, can everyone do that? And the answer is probably no. So the question really becomes, if Ohio State does this, if Georgia does this, if Alabama does this, if Texas or Texas A&M does this, it's not a problem. They have every ability to kind of split this money however they want and keep a lot of these sports intact, just in different facets, getting different money, whether it's scholarships or NIL or the revenue sharing. There's plenty of ways to keep all of these sports intact and kind of the way that we like them. Now, the question becomes, what happens if a UCLA gets in on that party and says, if they're giving 80% of their revenue to the football team, we probably should too, because we got to keep pace with these teams if we want to be competing at a very high level. Now, as we've talked about with UCLA, they're not exactly rolling in cash over there. They lost about $40 million in the athletic budget a year ago and have been in the red for the past, I think, 5 years. So it's not like everyone has the same ability to make all this work and kind of split this money however they want, but, figure it out on the back end with scholarships and NIL. Not everyone has that ability, and it's going to open a huge door. And I think one of the things that is going to happen, I feel very confident in this, if I'm being totally honest with you, is there's going to be a lawsuit. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know, where it's going to come from, but let's say the SEC is successful in putting in this model that they've kicked around, where 80% or 90% in general are going towards men's sports and 10% are going to women's sports. There's an argument to be made that they are violating Title IX. Now, the skirt around would be that 90% of this money would be going to men, in the back pay payments would be going to former men's athletes, but the reality is Title IX is a very, very ironclad thing, and it's something that has been huge in college sports for some time and has helped out not only women's sports but men's sports as well. So it'll be fascinating to watch what happens with Title IX going forward. It'll be fascinating to watch if, let's say, this SEC deal is passed through and a lot of the money is going towards the men's sports. There's going to be a women's athlete, someone that pops up and says, this isn't necessarily how this was supposed to go. And I think there will be a lawsuit on someone's hands down the road. Now, I don't necessarily know what that'll look like. I don't know who will be sued at the other end of it, but the reality is there's a lot of questions around how this money is going to be split up. I think a lot of us were a little bit worried about this kind of new step because it answered a big question in what is the compensation going to look like for college athletes, but it asked like 500 more questions during that time. And I think that's the big problem here is you introduce this new thing that pretty much has to be implemented by the end of the year almost, at least in the next 12 months. You have to have a really good idea of how you're going to split up this money, because if you don't, then you're already behind the eight ball. So all of this has to happen really quickly, and there's not really a good idea for what the rules are going into this. So a lot of this stuff is going to be ironed out in the future. A lot of this stuff, whether it's rules that apply to absolutely everyone, whether it's rules depending on your conference or depending on your school. I don't know how much autonomy some of these different entities will have in this conversation, but the reality is they need to know the rules. They need to know what can be allocated, because if it was up to them, I think a lot of this money would go towards football, but there needs to be some type of buffer between that, and not necessarily to say they can't spend that money, or at least the majority of that money, on the revenue sharing sport or on the revenue making sports, but they can absolutely split the pie a little bit more evenly than I think a lot of people want around the country. So once we get those rules in place, once we have an idea of Title IX is ironclad in this new agreement, and you have to, split this money evenly, or the opposite, Title IX can be skirted in this new world, and you have the ability to push a lot of money into football and basketball, but you might have to compensate it on the back end with scholarships and things of that nature. So there's a lot of questions, and I think one of the biggest things, the Kentucky president said this, where he just doesn't know the rules. He says, tell me the rules and I will live by them, but as of right now, we don't know the rules. And I think that's something that is a sentiment that I'm sure a lot of presidents and ADs and coaches feel around the country. So it gives you an idea of what this house settlement was. It was a lot about getting those cases kind of off the NCAA's table. It got rid of 3 of big-time antitrust cases that they absolutely needed off the books. Now, it creates a lot more questions down the road, and you have to figure out answers for that fairly quickly if you're athletic departments, if you're the NCAA in general. So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think the powers that be have a lot of work to do to figure out how this is going to be implemented. Is Title IX upheld in this new ruling? And if it's not, how do we keep women's sports, afloat in this new kind of world? So it'll be fascinating to watch. I think it's one of those things that a lot of people around the country are biting their nails right about now, trying to figure out what the future holds for their sport. So it'll be really weird to watch. It'll be one of those things that we'll look back on in quite some time and figure out whether it was fair or not. But for the time being, we just need an answer. And I think we need it as soon as possible so people can start getting their ducks in a row and figuring out what this future looks like. But we're going to take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Kadyn Proctor a little bit. He is a guy that went through a very weird offseason. Let's just put it that way. Definitely had a lot of stuff that went into that, transferred to Iowa, transferred back to Bama. It sounds like he regrets that decision, and he regrets a number of decisions he made throughout this process. So I want to get into why that is and how it's a fantastic thing for the future of the transfer portal right after this. So stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the house settlement money and how that's going to be split up and how there are a lot of questions around what the rules are for that split up. But as we get into our next segment here, let's talk about Kadyn Proctor and a very, very interesting offseason that he had. He was the transfer portal cautionary tale of the year. I think we all fully understand that. He started in the playoff game for Bama. Once Saban retired and called it a day, he decided to move on to Iowa, where he was committed for quite some time during high school, so it was not so much of a surprise that if he was going to transfer, that was where he was going to end up. But he was not there for very long. He's decided to transfer back to Alabama, I think somewhere in March, so really didn't participate in too much of spring practice for the Hawkeyes and found his way back to Tuscaloosa. And it was one of those things that definitely sent a lot of shockwave through the entirety of college football, and a lot of fan bases were none too happy about the way that he handled that situation. And the good news is, neither is he. He is very regretful, I think very upset about the way that things went down, and it's one of those things that I think all of us kind of saw happening, right? No one necessarily watched this unfold and thought this kid was making all of the right decisions at the exact right time, and I think he fully understands that, and even one of his teammates had said that before he even left Alabama. One of his own former teammate, or one of his teammates now, I suppose, Wilkin Formby, said, "You're going to come back." Basically, had a conversation with him, and Kadyn Proctor said they would joke about it all the time, but then it became reality, and he was back at Alabama. So this is obviously a very wild story. It's something that has set off a lot of college football fans against Kadyn Proctor, against some of the transfer portal rules and all of that type of thing, and I fully understand that. It was a very frustrating little diatribe that he went on there, and it was something that I think a lot of us were afraid of in college football. So it was a huge thing, and there's no two ways about that. But I think Kadyn Proctor finding his way back to Alabama, and not only finding his way back, but doing it the way that he has, I think is huge for the future of the transfer portal. When we look at the portal today, we have so many issues with the way that things go on, unlimited transfers kind of being willy-nilly, not having the ability to really think out your decisions fully, or frankly, just having the ability to not do that and jump into the portal, which sounds like what Kadyn Proctor did. It sounded like he had a conversation with Nick Saban where it felt like Nick Saban was sticking around, and that seemed to be the sentiment around a lot of Alabama before he ended up retiring. And once he retired, it sounded like he was out the door. It sounded like Kadyn Proctor was like, well, if you're not going to be around, then I'm not going to be around. So he found his way over to Iowa, and he fully regrets that decision. He came back to Alabama and went to Kalen DeBoer and apologized for saying he didn't hear them out effectively, and definitely has come back to the team and really made a huge effect right away. Kalen DeBoer has been absolutely glowing with this kid's work ethic and everything he's done since he's got back on campus. So absolutely fantastic for this kid, fantastic for Alabama, but for the transfer portal, it's huge because I think a lot of us hate the number of people that are going in. We hate the craziness that is going on, and we hate that some of our best players are not sticking around at our schools for quite some time. But I think with someone like Kadyn Proctor, who is so talented, who is such a front-facing person in the sport, it's a huge thing for other kids to learn from his mistakes. And he's being very forward with it, saying it was a mistake. And it was one of those things that he shouldn't have done this way. And I really hope that other people are listening to that sentiment, because it's the ultimate example of the grass isn't always greener on the other side. And sometimes you need to take a second, whether it's going through spring with a new coaching staff or going through a season with a new coaching staff, whatever that looks like for you. I think the biggest thing for college athletes, especially for young college athletes, is to just hear out every side, to make sure that you fully understand what Kalen DeBoer is about, what you fully understand what Alabama might look like going forward, and then you can make your decision. And then you can figure out, maybe Iowa is a better fit for me. But it sounded like He made a decision out of emotion, not necessarily out of as much logic as he would have liked, and it kind of got away from him for a second. But all that being said, he came right back, he apologized, and is really owning up to his decision in a really forward way, and I really do applaud him for that. I think it's a huge thing for so many different kids who are coming up in high school ranks right now, who are in college right now, and have flirted with the portal or have thought about getting in. It gives you an idea of what can happen. And let's be honest, not everyone's Kadyn Proctor. Kadyn Proctor is one of the most remarkable offensive tackles in the entire country. That's why he was starting as a freshman at Alabama. That's why he was such a beast. And it was why when, they were playing that game against Michigan, he played on a torn ligament in his ankle because he was that good. They needed that guy on the field, and he didn't necessarily have his best game by any means, but the reality is this kid is remarkable, and that's just the way of the world. And when you are that remarkable, you kind of have the ability to do something like this. You have the ability to transfer away from somewhere and maybe in a couple of months call them back up and say, I'd like to come back, and they will welcome you with open arms. That's not going to happen for 99.9% of the kids that do this. So it gives you an idea of the transfer portal has been a very dangerous thing for a long time. And I think a lot of us have been watching it from the sidelines and saying, this is going to happen and this is going to happen. And a lot of that stuff has. A lot of the kids making decisions just based off NIL, a lot of the kids making rash emotional decisions instead of thinking out the best option for them. A lot of this stuff has happened, but it feels like Kadyn Proctor is the best example of someone that did it remarkably forward-facing and is doing it right now remarkably forward-facing by, coming forward, doing this article with, I believe, the Bama team over there at 247 Sports, and they broke it down in such a way where it really felt like he was almost seeking this out. It was almost like he kind of wanted to put this message out into the world because he knew that it would be helpful to other athletes down the road, and he knew that he made a mistake, and he knew that there were going to be people that are very upset with him and that have problems with him going forward, but that's not necessarily the worry for Kadyn Proctor, for a lot of us in college football, where this issue is obviously not the way that we wanted this to go down, and it's definitely something that we wish we could fix in the future, but Kadyn Proctor, snubbing Iowa in this first instance and, not necessarily doing what they wanted them to do and pissing off a lot of Hawkeye fans. Let's just be totally honest about it. But the reality is he did so much more good for the future of the transfer portal and more kids who are younger than him to get an idea of this is a dangerous game. And you're playing in kind of a new world, in a world that might not have your best interests at heart at all times, where there's not a lot of rules around NIL right now. I think we all fully understand that. There's not a lot of rules around what coaches can and can't say to a kid to make a kid commit, and that is a super big danger, and it's actually something that we'll get in tomorrow when we break down some NIL stuff from the On3 Elite Camp. But when we're talking about Kadyn Proctor, he didn't necessarily represent himself great this offseason. I don't think there's anyone that can say any differently. He definitely came off a little bit rash, a little bit, I don't want to say childish, but he just didn't necessarily make a decision that I think was in the best interest for him, and one that was not necessarily the best thought out decision in hindsight. But him coming back, him, going to Kalen DeBoer, apologizing, getting straight to work, and showing that he is more than willing to put in all the work, every effort that they absolutely need him to do, it shows that, there is a way to go about this that is the right way. And I think Kadyn Proctor, if you asked him to go back to January and redo it all over again, he's staying at Bama, and he's hearing Kalen DeBoer out, and he's figuring out what the new Bama looks like, and probably is still there because it seems like it's going pretty well down there in Tuscaloosa right now. So overall, this is one of those issues where Iowa fans are going to be mad at Kadyn Proctor. There's no two ways about that. There are going to be fans that think he was being selfish or think he was, being a child, whatever it is, whatever critique you have about the decisions that he made this offseason, I'm sure he has a lot of those critiques about himself. And I also think that with him making this mistake, with him being forward-facing and being one of the best players in the country and everyone following this story, there's a lot of guys looking at him right now and saying, I don't want to be him. And it's not necessarily, you don't want to make those decisions or you don't want to be bouncing around too much, but also you might not have the ability to be Kadyn Proctor. Not everyone has the ability to bounce around in the transfer portal and always find a home because they are a 5-star talent, because they are a linchpin on the offensive line. So if you're a kid that is not Kadyn Proctor, just think about your decision for a little bit longer than you might think you need to or you might want to, because this shows you what can happen. This shows you that a lot of kids out there, a lot of athletes out there are looking for instant gratification in this new world, but the reality is the good thing for a lot of these athletes is to find the place that they feel the most comfortable and move forward from there. And you can't really do that unless you hear out the new coaching staff and you hear out some of the changes that they're getting. So this is one of those stories that it was really bad for quite a while, and I was upset about it. I'm sure a lot of you were upset about it just because it changed the way that a lot of people looked at the transfer portal, and it made me think that a lot of these kids look at it as kind of a wayward place in between, wanting to be at one team but not really sure. You can just jump in the portal and figure it out later. This gives you a really, really good idea that that's not necessarily the best way to go about business. And I hope that other people follow suit. I hope other people listen to him because he was very honest. This is not the way to go about it. And if you do go about it this way, you're putting yourself in a lot of danger for your future. So a fascinating story. Huge props to Kadyn Proctor for owning up to that mistake and being forward-facing with that, because a lot of guys in the past just haven't been because of shame or because of worry or whatever it is. And this is something we absolutely needed for the transfer portal. So it'll be fascinating to watch that and see what he does at Alabama once again. But we're going to take our second break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some playoff Cinderellas and how I think they might not look the way that you might want them to look or the way you might be expecting them to look right now. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Kadyn Proctor and how he really regrets the decisions he made in the transfer portal over the offseason, how it's likely a huge thing for the future of the transfer portal and making sure this dies down just a little bit. So definitely huge news there, but let's get into some playoff Cinderellas and how I'm not necessarily sure they'll look the way that you want them to look. I do think that we'll get some Cinderella-like teams in the 12-team playoff. I'm just not sure they're going to be group of 5 teams. So let's start to break this down and get into what exactly I mean here. So when we talk about Cinderellas in the 12-team playoff, we always like to lean to the group of 5 teams, and for good reason. There's a lot of really incredible group of 5 teams, and that would be one of the craziest stories that we have seen in quite some time. If a group of 5 team was able to get to the 12-team playoff, maybe win a couple of games, make their run to the semifinals or maybe the national championship, and do something remarkable. I don't think that's necessarily possible, and no disrespect to those group of 5 teams, there's plenty of really, really good ones around the country, but when you look at group of 5 teams right now, the ceiling that I have for pretty much everyone across the board is you can win a first-round game. There is an ability to possibly steal a first-round game from a Power 5 team. Now, Is it going to be easy? Absolutely not, because the majority of these group of 5 teams, actually I would bet all of them for the foreseeable future, will have to go to another team's stadium to play that opening round game, and winning that game is going to be incredibly tough. But the reality is, I do think that is possible. I just think that might be the ceiling for what they can do. I think when you talk about their really incredible players at the group of 5 level, Kaydn Salter at Liberty, Mario Williams transferred from USC to Tulane, a ton of players down at that level. Ricky White is a fantastic receiver over at UNLV. So there's so many really, really good players at the group of 5 level. The issue is that's not necessarily what makes a championship team. Now, you need those players, don't get me wrong, but the thing you need more than anything else is depth. You need people that can play, 2, 3, maybe even 4 deep in some of these games to win what looks like to be 17 games to win a national title if you're a group of 5 team, 16 to get, into the final or semifinal and figure it out from there. But the reality is these teams are going to have to go undefeated to get in the first place, because I would be very surprised if there were no group of 5 teams that were undefeated. So I think that's going to have to happen. And then you got to go to someone else's building. You got to beat them there. And then you got to play probably one of the best teams in the country, maybe an SEC or a Big Ten champion, and figure it out from there. So it's one of those things where when we look at the group of 5 teams, there's a lot of really, really good ones. There's just not ones that have, third-line guys that can play with Georgia's third-line guys or Oregon's third-line guys, and you don't have necessarily the ability to go as deep as you would like. And with a possible 17-game schedule ahead of you, you're going to need as many guys, as many bodies as possible, and it's just more of an ability for those bigger teams to do that. So I'd love to sit here and tell you that a group of 5 team is going to make a remarkable run, and I'm not necessarily saying it can't happen, but realistically, I don't necessarily see it in the cards. I think one of the teams that I'm watching a little bit closer is Liberty with Kaydn Salter, because he is one of the most electric players, electric quarterbacks in the entire country. So if there was someone that could totally tip the scales and change the way that we look at the 12-team playoff in the group of 5, it might just be that guy. But that is also something that I think is a little bit unlikely. But that doesn't mean we're not going to get Cinderellas. I do think there is going to be plenty of teams that have a couple of losses on their schedule and then find their way into the playoff and make a little bit of a run. And I think that team right there, LSU, would be a fantastic example. When you look at the SEC and the Big Ten today, there's going to be teams that lose 3 games that find their way into the playoff. And frankly, I think there should be, because when you look at those schedules comparative to the ACC or the Big 12 schedules, it's a lot harder. Let's just be totally honest with you. And I think when you look at, say, a 9-3 LSU team or a 9-3 Ole Miss team or one of those type of teams, if they roll in at 11 or 12, they're a little bit more adept to go on the road and play at, Penn State or play at Oregon or play at Texas, whatever that looks like. They're a little bit more adept to do that because they have a lot of bodies behind them. Now, this LSU team I'm a little bit worried about because the defensive side of the ball is none too good, but just in general, they're an example of a team that absolutely could do something. Penn State is another great example of a team that can make some noise in this scenario where maybe you go 10-2, maybe you do the classic Penn State season, but you still find your way into the party, and maybe one of these teams has suffered an injury in the early parts of the year, and he finally found his way back onto the field, and that's a huge piece for them going forward. So there's a lot of different ways that this can unfold. There's a lot of different, paths for Cinderellas to pop up. It just won't be, JMU or App State or Troy. It will be, LSU or Ole Miss or Penn State or one of these teams that definitely has that depth, has that physicality, has all of the things that you really need to make a run in this playoff, because it's going to be really hard to win 17 games. Now, some of these big-time teams likely won't have to do that to win a national title, but the group of 5 will absolutely have to do that. And I just don't see how that's physically possible, frankly, looking at all of these rosters. But the reality is I do think we're going to get a very, very cool run. I do think we're going to get, a team that we didn't to get in maybe in week 6 or in week 7 to really heat up towards the end of the season and find their way in at an 11 or 12 seed and then really make a run. I think that is definitely something that could be on the table, whether it's a 3-loss team or maybe it's just a 2-loss team that was just right on the outside of a Big 10 or SEC or Big 12 championship. So there's a lot of really, really cool storylines. There's no two ways about that. And I think having the group of 5 in on this playoff is a really fun thing. The reality is they're just not really playing the same sport. So I fully expect, a lot of these group of 5 teams to have to go to Austin, Texas, or Eugene, Oregon, or, Happy Valley, and play some of these teams and just get railroaded. And it's not necessarily to say it's not an honor to get there and they haven't had an incredible season, but I would just say if you're expecting, a Tulane or a App State or one of these smaller teams to make a deep run in the playoff, I wouldn't hold your breath. No disrespect to those two teams, but it's going to be really, really tough for them to get there. Now, one of the very interesting things that I'm going to be watching in terms of variability and in terms of upsets is what happens when, let's say, the SEC championship loser. So let's just Texas loses to Georgia in the SEC championship this upcoming year, and they're the 5 seed. And they get a 12 seed that is, let's say, Miami or Kansas State or Kansas, one of the teams that might be a little bit on the lower side of the ACC or the Big 12, but found their way in because they had a good schedule. Maybe they lost in their conference championship, whatever that looks like. Those are the teams that I'm really interested in because we all know over the past couple of years, a lot of energy has been pushed towards the SEC and the Big 10, with the Big 12 and the ACC kind of falling off just a little bit and people not caring about them as much, not talking about them as much. And I would be shocked if those players weren't a little bit angry about that. I would be shocked if they didn't have a little bit extra motivation to make something happen this upcoming year against those teams for that reason. So I think when we get into the playoff and maybe you have a, Oregon against Miami or Arizona against Bama or one of these really, really interesting games where it is an ACC team, it is a Big 12 team against an SEC or a Big 10 team, there's going to be a lot of talk that the Big 10 or the SEC team is going to just roll on through. They're going to find their way to the second round because that team is coming to your house. They're a Big 10 or ACC team. They're not necessarily to be worried about. They're going to have to be worried about. I promise you that. Those teams are going to come with as much energy as possible. They are going to want to make a statement. And I think if we're talking about motivation to make a run in the playoff, very few schools in the country have as much motivation as those Big 12 and ACC schools because they want to prove everyone wrong. They want to show that the new playoff agreement that they signed is not indicative of how the conferences actually work and how the conferences stack up to each other. And this would be the perfect way to make that statement. Now, do I necessarily expect some of those teams to pull that off? I don't know. I think it'll be very much up in the air, but I do know that Arizona has a better chance of going to Eugene, Oregon and getting a win than Georgia State does or James Madison does or one of these type of teams. So I think if we see a Cinderella, quote unquote, if we see one of those teams that kind of pop up and we don't expect them, it'll be one of those type of teams. It'll be, maybe a Big 12 or ACC teams that barely missed or barely lost their conference title and are very upset and have tons of motivation coming in. Or maybe it is an LSU or a Penn State that lost a couple of games but played a really tough schedule, maybe got healthy towards the end of the year, and then made a run in the 12-team playoff. So it will create chaos. I can promise you that. The 12-team playoff is going to be one of the weirder, one of the crazier things that we have seen in college football because I think it is going to create variability. I think there is going to be upsets. I think there will be some Cinderellas down the road. I just don't think they're going to be group of 5 teams. And I don't necessarily think that takes away too much from the Cinderella because I think the story is incredible regardless. But I do understand why some fans would be looking at, LSU or Penn State or one of these big-time teams making their way on a run and saying, this is not necessarily what I wanted. And it's not necessarily what I want either. I'd love to see a group of 5 team make a deep run in this playoff. But when I look at it at face value, it's just they don't necessarily have the things that you need to make a run, especially in a game where you're going to have to play a very physical team one week at their home and then go on the road and play another really physical team. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. Hopefully a group of 5 team proves me wrong and shuts me up on this, but from where I'm standing, I think you're more likely to see the Cinderella of LSU or Ole Miss than you are of Tulane or App State. So that'll be really interesting to watch, but we're going to take our third break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about an all-transfer portal team. We're going to go to the defensive side of the ball this time around. We did offense yesterday, but tons of really good defensive players. And we'll break down who I think might just make that first team all-transfer team right after this. So stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the playoff and how I think we're going to get Cinderellas in this 12-team playoff. I just don't think they might look the way that you're hoping they might look. So that'll be really interesting to watch, but let's get into an all-transfer portal team and let's move on over to the defense. We did the offense yesterday, tons of remarkable players on the offensive side of the ball, but defense might be even better, I'll be totally honest with you. Some really, really remarkable players found their way to new schools, and let's start to break down who I think might just be the best of the bunch. And let's start at defensive tackle. I have Jamari Caldwell and Walter Nolan, and Jamari Caldwell is one of those guys that is just an absolute need for Oregon. There's no two ways about that. When you watched Oregon a year ago, they got pushed around a little bit, especially on that interior, the defensive line, and I think we all understand when your interior defensive line isn't working, your edge rushing is not going to work. And they have plenty of talent on that edge rushing with Jordan Birch, with Mateo Uiagalelei, with Elijah Rushing coming in as a freshman. But you needed that force on the inside. You needed the guy to just eat up space, maybe get a couple of double teams, be a really good force in the run game, and then open up some doors for the pass rushers on the edge. So this is a huge win for Oregon. I think this guy might just be an first team all Big Ten selection at the end of the year. So just a really, really remarkable player coming over from Houston and definitely gives Oregon a much needed boost at a position that they were a little bit worried about. I won't lie to you. And then Walter Nolan moving over to Ole Miss. This one's a no-brainer. This is frankly one of the top 15, 20 players in the entire country. He can do just really remarkable things, and pretty much since he stepped on campus at College Station the first time around, he's done that. He absolutely jumped off the page in spring as a freshman and did really, really remarkable things throughout his 2 years at Texas A&M. But he found his way over to Ole Miss, and he is the best player that Ole Miss brought in this entire transfer portal class. And he's probably the most important because he can totally transform their defense. Because the biggest thing that you saw with Ole Miss a year ago is that defensive line of scrimmage was getting pushed around pretty much every game. And it was not very conducive to them being able to run the things that they want to run, where you're playing a lot of catch-up in these games, and you're trying to, score as many points as possible and do all of that type of stuff. And while, Lane Kiffin can win the games that way, it definitely does add a new layer of worry, a new layer of just variability to those games that hopefully they can take away with someone like Walter Nolan. So I think this guy's going to be huge, and I would be very surprised, honestly, if he didn't make an all-SEC team at the end of the year. But let's move on to edge rusher, and I'll start with Nick Scourton, going over to Texas A&M from Purdue. I think this guy is going to be absolutely huge. Every single tackle in the entire SEC should be just a little bit nervous right now. If you didn't see him last year, it was probably because he played for Purdue. No disrespect to Purdue, but it feels like this guy is a little bit under the radar despite being one of the best pass rushers in the entire country. He can do just incredible things, and I think SEC, when you really, really want to compete in that league, you need a good pass rush. There's no two ways about that. And I think A&M has a ton of ability on that team, but I think a guy like Nick Scourton could take them over to that next level where you're not only, playing pretty good football and kind of taking those steps forward under first-year head coach Mike Leach, but you might be kicking the door down in some of these games because Nick Scourton makes a play here or there that totally changes a game. So he's going to be huge for A&M. And then we stay in Texas for the edge rushing. Trey Moore going to Texas was absolutely huge, mainly because of the need. I think there might be more talented edge rushers out there. Princely Emmanuelin's fantastic. Tyler Barron, Marvin Jones Jr., all of those guys are very much on the group for this list. But when I think about Texas a year ago, the biggest thing that they were missing was pass rush. And if they had a pass rush, I think we might have them as a national title winner at this time. So it's something that they absolutely needed, and when you can get a guy that had 14 sacks a year ago, you're going to jump at the idea. He comes over from UTSA and has absolutely burst onto the scene in Austin. He has gotten absolutely rave reviews throughout spring, and I think he's going to be a force for this Texas team and be about as important as pretty much any player on the team that is not named Quinn Ewers. So very, very interesting. He'll be a huge piece to Texas' success this upcoming year. But let's move on to linebacker. This is a very interesting group to me, but I'm going to start with Jamon Dumas-Johnson moving over to Kentucky. He comes over from UGA, and I think we all understand that when you're a really good part of the UGA defense, you're going to be a great part of pretty much any defense in the entire country. And before Jamon Dumas-Johnson went down with an injury, he was a huge piece of that defense. He was right in the middle of it. He did a lot of really incredible things, and it just so happened that when he got injured, a guy named CJ Allen popped up onto the scene and totally stole the spotlight. So he found his way over to Kentucky and is going to do incredible things for them. I think it's an absolutely huge pickup for Kentucky. Gives their defense a little bit more structure, the linchpin in the middle of that defense that you absolutely need, and I think he's going to be absolutely huge for them. So a great pickup there. Tackett Curtis was a huge get for Wisconsin coming over from USC. We've talked about in the past, USC lost a ton of guys in the transfer portal, and they're kind of going through somewhat of a reinvention of that program right now, and a lot of the guys that left pretty much had to leave because they were not really willing to do some of the things that had to happen for them to become the team they wanted to become. Now, Tackett Curtis was not one of those guys. I promise you that USC did not want to lose this kid, and Wisconsin getting him is absolutely huge. I think he's one of those guys that he can be a starter for Wisconsin this year and then develop into one of the best linebackers in the entire Big 12 over time because he does really, really remarkable things on the field just as a freshman last year at USC, but with some better talent around him defensively, with a little bit better play calling, I think he could do just remarkable things. And then Jayshawn Barham, this is all about the hole that he fills. You're losing Junior Colson. You need that emotional leader, that vocal leader in the middle of that defense. Jayshawn Barham can absolutely be that. He was remarkable when he was at Maryland, and he did just incredible things there and definitely will bring over some of that to Michigan. And I think when you look at Michigan this upcoming year, the defense is going to be great. They brought in a ton of transfer portal guys in the back end late on in the process to really help out that defense. The defensive line is going to be good, has one of the best duos in the entire country in Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. And Jayshawn Barham just is the icing on top of the cake. I think he's going to do just incredible, incredible things for them and maybe just fill that void that Junior Colson left, even though he doesn't really need to for this defense to be really successful. But let's go to cornerback and let's talk about Jabbar Muhammad. This one's a layup. This is one of the best cornerbacks in the country a year ago, and coming over to Oregon is absolutely huge, especially when you steal him from Washington, who not many Duck fans like, let's just be honest. But Oregon brought in a ton of big-time players on the back end of their defense. They brought in Kobe Savage. They brought in tons of players that are going to make big-time differences for them this upcoming season. Jabbar Muhammad is absolutely number one on that list because when you look at the Big Ten this year, it's not necessarily like there are, crazy passing attacks that are totally going to spread you out, but there are really good wide receivers around the country, and you're going to need a guy that maybe follows them around the field or at least can shut down one side of the field for a lot of the game. And that's exactly what Jabbar Muhammad did for Washington a year ago. He was a huge reason that Washington was as successful as they were a year ago. So I think when you face guys like maybe Jeremiah Smith or Emeka Egbuka or Julian Fleming or all of those big-time players, you're going to have a guy that can match up and say, I'm going to beat you down in, down out. And I think Jabbar Muhammad is absolutely a guy that can do that. And then A.J. Harris is a guy that is a little bit off the beaten path here, but again, Penn State just needed this. They are losing Kalen King. They're losing Johnny Dixon. They're losing so many guys on the back end of that defense that you needed the big-time corner to come in and really hold down the position, and that's exactly what Harris has done. It sounds like throughout spring he has been one of the more impressive players on that team and definitely will be a huge player for them going forward. So I think when you look at Penn State this upcoming year, there was a huge worry about, are they going to be able to cover some of the guys that we just talked about? And I think A.J. Harris definitely gives them ability to really put their trust in his hands and kind of leave him out on an island and feel confident in that. And then let's get to safeties, and it starts with Caleb Downs. I don't think there's any question about this. I've said a number of times, I think he is one of, if not the best player in the country. When you go to Alabama and you lead them in tackles as a freshman, it's outright insane, and it deserves the utmost respect. I think this dude can do literally everything on the football field, is really great in coverage, can come down to the box, play run defense, can play almost kind of a linebacker type role in some plays, does just really, really incredible things. And I think he's one of those players that they're going to absolutely love up there at Ohio State. And really this entire safety group was very, very kind to Ohio State because Keon Saab found his way from Michigan to Alabama. So Ohio State gains one of the great safeties and one of their rivals loses one. So I did earlier in this week, I did want to correct this. Earlier in this week, I did say that Rod Moore had the ability to make a ton of money this upcoming year. I'm a little bit of a doofus because I meant to say Keon Saab. That was the player that I was leaning towards. Rod Moore, unfortunately, is injured and will be out for the year, but I meant to say Keon Saab, just a little bit of a brain fart there, so my apologies about that. But Keon Saab is a fantastic player and absolutely will be a starter for them this upcoming year. Maybe another transfer, and King Mack might be another starter at safety. But the guy is Malachi Moore, and I think he gives them so much ability to let these two other guys use a lot of their natural ability the way that they want. You know, Malachi Moore can kind of fit in wherever you need him to. So it gives you the ability to be a little bit more multiple in the back end, have guys kind of float from position to position a little bit. So overall, I mean, when you look at this transfer portal class, the defensive side of the ball was insane. From Walter Nolan to Princely Umanmielen, Derek Harmon, Jacoby Matthews, Dominic Williams, Tyler Barron, none of those guys made this group. And I think all of the guys on this group are just absolutely remarkable. So it gives you an idea of how many guys moved around. A ton of teams, their defense just changed complexion overnight almost. So it'll be fascinating to watch how all of those guys kind of go through this year. But let's take our final break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the Spotlight Wednesday for Oklahoma State, one of the most overlooked teams in the entire country. And I'll break down why exactly that is right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about my all-transfer portal team for the defensive side of the ball. Tons of really, really good defensive players found their way to new schools and wanted to break down who I think got it the best. But let's get into a Spotlight Wednesday and let's talk about the Oklahoma State Cowboys because everyone last year overlooked Oklahoma State going into the season. It was always about, Texas and Kansas State and Oklahoma and Kansas and all of those teams that are towards the top of that conference. And then Oklahoma State just kind of blew up the party, beat a lot of teams that people weren't expecting them to beat, did a lot of really, really incredible things. And Mike Gundy is just that way. That's the way that he operates. So it'll be fascinating to watch them this upcoming year. And I think when you look at this team, there's so much to like. They're fourth in the country in returning production at 77%. Only Iowa State is above them in terms of Big 12 teams, and there are a lot of Big 12 teams towards the top of that list. So it'll be a very interesting conference overall, but this team is very, very fascinating. When we start with the offense, I think it all starts with Ollie Gordon. There's no two ways about that. He's going to be the go-to back. He's going to be really a huge, huge part of this offense, maybe the biggest part of this team going forward for as long as he is on campus. So he is an absolutely huge piece. They added AJ Green over from Arkansas at running back as well. So I think that's a huge piece to them, just to give him a little bit of change of pace, let Ollie Gordon sit and catch his breath every now and then. So I think that'll be absolutely huge. Now, a running game is nothing without a good offensive line, and Oklahoma State has one of the best ones in the entire country. They're returning pretty much every single starter from a year ago, and they're all redshirt seniors. So they know what they're doing. There's no two ways about that. They know how they're playing together, and it's just insane that they have all those guys as redshirt seniors, but here we are. In fact, not one starter on this team, offense or defense, is below their junior year of college. So that's just wild, especially in a transfer portal era where a lot of movement and a lot of craziness. Mike Gundy does not deal with a lot of that. So he's had guys that have been there for quite some time. The receiving core, all the same. Rashad Owens, I tend to believe, is going to be the wide receiver one on this team. But Brennan Presley, who's played 52 games in his entire career, is going to be a great piece to this team, as is Deshaun Stribling, who is absolutely a fantastic player who really came on last year. The tight end group isn't necessarily fantastic by any means, but they are going to be more run blocking just in general. That's kind of just the way that Mike Gundy goes about his business. But then we come to the signal caller, Alan Bowman, who, a very veteran presence, has played a ton of really good football in his past and has made a living, really, from executing offenses at a high rate. He's not going to necessarily light the world on fire. He's not going to be, as Cam Newton would call it, a game changer, but game manager ain't too bad either, especially when you have a lot of the things around him that Oklahoma State does have, like that guy right there in Ollie Gordon. So I think they're going to be more than happy with Alan Bowman this year. I think he might just take a big-time step forward, frankly, this upcoming year with a lot of the really good things that he has around him. Now, the defense is much like the offense, a ton of returning production, a ton of veteran leadership all over the field. And it starts with the D-line. They kind of have three guys that have a lot of college football experience and only one guy coming in from somewhere else. So they had Obi Ezigbo came in from the D2 program, Kaydn University. He had 7.5 sacks, 10 tackles for loss. He'll likely be playing one of the defensive end positions. Obviously, coming up from D2, there's a little bit of a worry there, but there have been plenty of success stories, and Mike Gundy is no stranger to having good evaluations on kids. So I'm not necessarily super worried about him, but Colin Clay holding down that nose tackle position, he's going to be absolutely remarkable. Started there for most of the year last year, and then Cody Waltersheed is someone that I'm definitely watching very closely. Yet another redshirt senior on this team, and he's played really, really good football. I think he's someone that gives this defense just a really good kind of baseline, especially on that front line where you're going to have good run defense. You're going to have, pass rush from time to time, although he's not the most dynamic pass rusher in the world. But I think all of those guys are really going to work well together and are going to be exactly where you need them to be, exactly when you need them to be there. So that's going to be huge for them. The linebacking core is really where a lot of the star talent is, I suppose. When you talk about Nate Martin was an all Big 12 team player a year ago. Colin Oliver was a second team all Big 12 team a year ago. So it's a fantastic group. The only guy that is a question mark sort of is Justin Wright, who was injured last year, but he got a medical red shirt, is finding his way back in. He came over from the AAC, was a second-team All-AAC player twice during his time there, so he should be more than fine, especially with those two guys right next to him. This back end is incredible. As you would imagine, has a lot of experience, a lot of talent. Out of the 5 guys they return, I think they returned 58 starts from a year ago. So just to give you an idea of how insane this group is and how deep this group is, and one of those guys on that list is Lyric Rawls, who started the first 3 games of the season and then got injured. So it could have been much, much more starts on the season than they have right now. But it's just insane the amount of ability, the amount of veteran leadership this team is going to have. And when you have that plus Mike Gundy, a lot of things can go right for you. Let's just put it that way. But let's get to the schedule here and break down what Oklahoma State is up against this year. It starts pretty easy. You got South Dakota State. It's not necessarily the easiest game in the world, but absolutely a game that they should win. But overall, the first 6 games of this schedule are grueling. They are going to be the ones that totally decide the way that this season goes. I mean, 1 through 6 is just an absolute grind where South Dakota State, while you should win that game, and if they don't win that game, we're having a very different conversation around Oklahoma State. I do think that's not going to be a layup by any means. Then you have Arkansas coming to town. That's going to be a toughie. Arkansas is absolutely going to want that game. They're not necessarily in line for a ton of wins this upcoming season. So this is one of those games that they will absolutely be ready for. And then going to Tulsa, I never get it. I don't understand why a Power 5 team would ever go play at a Group of 5 team, because it feels like you're asking for something bad to happen. Now, Oklahoma State is much better than Tulsa is, and frankly, a lot of Oklahoma State fans will make the drive from Stillwater to Tulsa to be at this game, but man, that is a decision that I would not have made if I was Oklahoma State, and it's just a game that you might want to keep an eye on that weekend just in case something crazy happens. But then you get into the 3-game part of this schedule that I think will totally define what Oklahoma State is in 2024. When you start with Utah at home, that's a huge one. And everyone knows that Utah going into the season is the class of the conference. If you can win that game, you knock them off that throne very quickly. And then at Kansas State is an absolutely huge one, followed by West Virginia. So if you can go 2-1 in that stretch, I think you're in really, really good shape. If you go 3-0 in that stretch, then things get really, really interesting. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. I think it's a very top-heavy schedule. Those Friday games between BYU and Colorado are a little bit nerve-wracking to me, if I'm being honest. Colorado might just be fighting for a bowl game in that last week, which will give them some very extra motivation. And then we talked about Tulsa being a sneaky game, but also Texas Tech is one of those games that I'm a little bit nervous about, because Texas Tech could absolutely be a team that makes a run in the Big 12, and maybe they're fighting for a spot in Arlington towards the end of the year, and they really want to win that game. So a very doable schedule. The first 6 weeks of the season are going to be the place that this is decided, but a 5-1, 4-2 in that span, you'll absolutely be in the conversation for a Big 12 title. So this is a very experienced team. Tons of leadership, tons to like about this team, and I think when you have Mike Gundy as the leader, a lot of things are going to go right. So if they can just do what they did a year ago, where it ride Ollie Gordon and just do that every single week, and every now and then maybe Alan Bowman needs to step up and make a couple of big plays, but Ollie Gordon's the guy until the wheels fall off. I think you have the ability to win this conference, to go to the playoff, to do some really remarkable things this year. So a manageable, top-heavy schedule, a lot of really good things rolling for Oklahoma State. Now, will they be one of those teams that could be a Cinderella-type team in the playoff, because they have a lot of things in place that the Cinderella teams would need? You know, the veteran leadership, the depth, all of those things are huge for this team, and I think they might just be a team to watch this upcoming year for not only to win the Big 12, but maybe just make a little bit of run in the playoffs. So I'm definitely going to be watching the Cowboys very, very closely this upcoming year, but that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have incredible people covering every single sport you could possibly want. So if you need anything in the world of sports, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.